Before we begin, imagine a house too quiet, a marriage signed in silence, and a letter never meant to be found. If you believe some stories are meant to unfold slowly, like tea steeping or hearts healing, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us bring more quiet, meaningful stories to life. I used to imagine my wedding day would smell like roses. But that morning, all I could smell was sandalwood and silence. The ceremony took place in a vaulted room lined with dark wood, its air thick with centuries of varnish and quiet judgment. There were no violins, no laughter, just the hushed shuffle of expensive shoes against stone floors, and the sound of my own heart, muted by the tight silk of my dress. Lucas Arden didn't say much. He stood tall beside me, stoic, deliberate, dressed in a steel gray suit that matched his eyes exactly. He didn't offer his hand, not even a glance. Only when the officiant asked if he took me as his wife, he nodded once and said, "Yes," as agreed. Not with love, not until death, just as agreed. I wanted to run, not out of fear, not even sadness, but because in that moment I realized the girl I had been, who once dreamed of wildflowers, vows whispered beneath willow trees, and kisses that meant everything, was already gone. I had buried her somewhere between the oncology ward where my mother lay, and the debt collector's voice that had turned cold the second he found out I was 24, unmarried and expendable. "We" signed the papers under the dim chandelier. His pen moved with precision. Mine trembled. Afterward, he didn't take my hand or escort me out of the room. He simply turned to the lawyer and said, "We'll revisit the terms at year's end. If she wants adjustments, she can contact legal." That was our wedding toast. The estate was enormous. Too quiet, too old, too perfect. Polished banisters gleamed like bone. Curtains hung heavy and still. Every step I took echoed like a secret. They'd prepared a room for me, not ours, just mine. A suite with pale wallpaper and a mahogany wardrobe taller than any man I'd ever met. I stood there, for a long time, staring at the mirror, unsure of whether I looked more like a bride or a transaction. The dress, ivory and soft, felt like a costume now. I unzipped it slowly, the fabric brushing my skin like a whisper I couldn't translate. I found the letter that night. It wasn't hidden, just tucked carelessly between two old books in the wardrobe's bottom drawer. Books I suspected hadn't been touched in decades. The envelope was pale blue, edges frayed, and the writing on the front was unmistakable. "For Emma, if I never find the courage to tell her." It was my mother's handwriting. I sat on the window seat, the cold pressing through the glass into my spine, and opened it with shaking fingers. "Dearest Em, if you're reading this, I suppose I never told you the truth. Not all of it. Your father? He made mistakes. Not just to us, but to others. One in particular I carry with me. The Ardens. What happened in that house, Lucas's house, it began long before you were born. I wish I could say your marriage today is just a business deal, but it's more than that. It's the consequence of a story I never finished. I only hope he doesn't make you pay for your father's sins, and that if he ever shows you kindness, you'll know it's not weakness, it's a kind of courage." The letter ended there. No signature. Just a smudge of ink, maybe from her thumb. Or a tear. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling like I was holding a piece of her breath. Something she left behind in case I got lost in someone else's world. Outside, the estate lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over the trees. I could see the greenhouse from here, glass panes shining like wet leaves. Somewhere in that silence, I thought of her voice again. When I was sick as a child, she used to sing to me in the kitchen. Her voice was quiet, sometimes off-key, but it was home. I remembered the way she'd wipe sweat from my forehead with her sleeve and whisper, "Sleep, my little star. The world will forgive us, as long as we forgive ourselves." I hadn't heard her sing in years, Illness stole her breath, but tonight, her words came back to me like wind through a cracked door. The bed was soft, but I didn't sleep. I kept thinking of Lucas, of the way he didn't meet my eyes, of the way he didn't touch me. And somehow, that silence was louder than if he had shouted. Was he angry, cold, or just protecting himself? I didn't know. But I knew this. I had married a man who shared my last name now, but not my story. Not yet. And beneath the silence of the sandalwood walls, I could feel something pressing, like a memory not mine, waiting to be remembered. That night, I whispered into the dark, "Mom, did I do the right thing?" The wind outside didn't answer. But it carried the smell of sandalwood through the room again, curling like smoke under the door, as if the house itself had heard me. And maybe, in its own quiet way, it would begin to speak. For 3 days after the wedding, Lucas and I lived like tenants on opposite ends of a long, echoing hallway. We didn't eat together. We didn't speak. He left before I woke and returned long after I had retreated to my room with a book I couldn't finish and a mind I couldn't quiet. Some nights I'd pass his study and catch the soft clink of ice in a glass, the low murmur of his voice on a call. But mostly, there was just the sound of this house breathing, settling wood, distant clocks, and the rustle of wind against old glass. The quiet was a presence, not a lack, and I wasn't used to it. On the 4th night, I woke to a sharp pain in my throat and an ache behind my eyes. I had a fever. I could feel it climbing, curling itself around my neck like ivy. The room spun gently. My skin was hot and cold all at once. I managed to stumble into the bathroom for a damp cloth, but by the time I returned to bed, everything blurred. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking up to the scent of ginger and honey. A steaming cup sat on the nightstand, still warm, its ceramic surface fogging the small dish it rested on. Next to it, a folded note in tight, elegant handwriting. "Your mother used to make this. I hope it still helps. L." I stared at the note longer than I stared at the tea. He had remembered, or asked, or listened. The last time I was sick like this, I had been 13. I'd fainted after gym class, and Mom had walked all the way from the bookstore with a thermos of hot ginger tea wrapped in a towel. She sat beside me on the couch, humming softly, fingers brushing my bangs aside. "Ginger helps clear the fog," she said, "in the body and in the heart." I sipped the tea slowly now, letting the warmth smooth out the jagged parts of me. The flavor was imperfect. Too much honey, not enough lemon. But it was real. And in that moment, real was more than enough. I stayed in bed the next day, drifting in and out of dreams. In one of them, I was a little girl again, hiding under the kitchen table, eavesdropping on my parents arguing. My mother's voice was firm but tired. My father's was quiet, almost ashamed. I couldn't hear the words, only the weight of them. When I woke, I found a new cup of tea on the nightstand. Still warm. No note this time. Just presence. On the 3rd day, I was strong enough to walk downstairs. I expected to find the house empty again, the way it always was. But when I stepped into the kitchen, barefoot, wrapped in an old sweater, I saw Lucas at the stove, sleeves rolled up, boiling water with the same tense concentration he probably used in board meetings. He looked up, startled to see me. "You're awake," he said simply. I nodded. "So are you." He half smiled. The first sign of one anyway. It vanished almost as quickly as it came. "You shouldn't be out of bed." I was thirsty. He gestured to the tea kettle. "I'll make you more." I hesitated at the edge of the room. "You didn't have to do that." He didn't look at me when he replied. "Neither did you, when you said yes." There it was. A sentence. A fracture in the silence. Not affection, not apology, but acknowledgement. He poured the tea into a mug and slid it across the counter. I sat down slowly, feeling the cool stone beneath my palms. "Thank you," I said. Lucas nodded and turned to clean up. I noticed the dishes were already done. The kitchen was too neat to have seen much life, but this morning, it felt different. Like someone had opened a window. We didn't talk after that. But something had shifted. That afternoon, I went to check the mailbox out front. It was one of those heavy brass ones attached to the gate, covered in ivy. There were only 2 envelopes, both hospital bills. I flipped one over and saw that it had already been paid. Not in my name, in his. Lucas had paid the entire balance for my mother's treatment 2 weeks ago. Before the wedding, my throat tightened. He hadn't mentioned it. No grand gesture, no strings. Just a quiet decision that must have cost him thousands. And something else. The willingness to help without needing to be seen. That night, I sat by the window again, sipping the last of the tea. I looked at the letter from my mother, still folded neatly in the drawer beside me, still unfinished. If he ever shows you kindness, you'll know it's not weakness. It's a kind of courage. She had been right. Lucas hadn't touched me. He hadn't demanded closeness, but he had stood in that kitchen making tea, and he had paid the bills that might have buried my mother, not as part of a deal, but as a choice. Outside, a late autumn wind stirred the trees. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and let myself believe, for the first time since the wedding, that maybe, just maybe, this house wasn't just a cage built from debt and duty. Maybe it was a waiting room, and maybe, in time, we'd learn how to meet each other in it. It had rained overnight. The windows were streaked with thin rivers of gray light, and the trees bent in silence outside the estate walls. I sat at the breakfast table, untouched toast growing cold beside a cup of tea I hadn't stirred. My fever had passed, but something else had taken its place. A tightness across my chest I couldn't quite name. The letter. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. I had read it a dozen times by now. Every sentence carved itself deeper into me, especially the last. Everything began in that house. This house. And it wasn't just about Lucas. It was about my father. After breakfast, I returned to the library. Not the grand one Lucas used for meetings, but the small, windowed room down the hall. The one that smelled of paper and winter and lemon oil. It reminded me of my childhood. Rainy Saturdays spent with a blanket and a flashlight, my mother's hand on my back as I read. I hadn't planned on finding anything. I just needed air that wasn't filtered through questions I couldn't ask, out loud. The shelves were mostly business and law texts, neatly alphabetized. But on the bottom row, wedged behind a row of investor reports, I found a photo album. Dusty, plain, its leather spine cracked with age. Inside were black and white photographs, some dated back to the 1970s, a young woman in a wide-brimmed hat. A boy, Lucas maybe, barefoot on the lawn. A man standing beside a car with one hand on the roof and the other holding a glass of scotch. And then, there he was. My father, smiling, confident, arms folded beside a younger Lucas, both standing in front of what looked like a small brick building. Some kind of shop, maybe. No one had labeled the photo, but I recognized my father's posture, that half-smile he wore when he thought he had already won. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I should have. When I looked up, Lucas was standing in the doorway. He didn't speak at first, just followed my gaze to the photo still resting on my lap. "You found it?" he said quietly. I didn't know what to say. That was the day he signed the lease, Lucas continued, stepping into the room. My father gave him a space in the storefront we owned. No collateral, just a handshake and a promise. He paused, then added with a sharpness that didn't belong in the room. 3 months later, your father refinanced the property behind our backs and sold his shares. We lost everything. My father died of a heart attack 6 weeks later. The words dropped like stones between us. I stood up slowly. My voice caught somewhere in my throat. I didn't know. He never told us. Lucas looked at me, but not with blame, with something worse, understanding. I believed he was a good man once, too. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the words felt hollow. I hadn't made the deal. I hadn't betrayed anyone. And yet here I was, wearing his name, living in the house built on the ashes of Lucas's trust. So, the marriage, I said, trying to breathe through the question. Was it just revenge? He didn't flinch. Just shook his head once. It could have been. Maybe that's why I agreed to it at first. But I never wanted to humiliate you, Emma. If I did, I would have let the world know who you were, who your father was. But I didn't. He took a step closer, then stopped himself. I thought maybe if I married you, I'd stop hating him, that somehow giving you a place here would, I don't know, balance the scales. I nodded, even though nothing felt balanced at all. After he left, I sat alone in the library with the photograph in my lap. My father had died a year ago, and I'd cried at his funeral, but not for the man. I cried for the loss of a story I had, wanted to believe in. A father who'd been brave, honorable, someone I could model my own strength after. Now that story had a crack, and through it, I saw a stranger. And yet, I also saw Lucas, still here, still carrying it, still trying. That evening, I sat beside my mother's bed at the hospital. Her color was better, her breathing stronger, but her eyes stayed closed, and her hand in mine was still too light, like it had forgotten how to hold. I reached into my purse and pulled out the letter. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered. "You knew what he did, and you married him. Anyway, you stayed." I paused, blinking away tears. I think I understand now. Staying isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's resistance. A kind of grace. When I got home, the lights in the kitchen were on. Lucas was at the counter again, sleeves rolled, pouring 2 cups of tea. He looked up when I entered and hesitated. "I figured you might be cold," he said. I took the cup he handed me. It was hot and fragrant. Ginger again, but better this time. "You adjusted the recipe," I said softly. He looked at me. His expression unreadable. "You looked like you needed something real." I held the cup, the warmth seeping into my palms. "So do you." We didn't speak again that night, but we drank our tea at the same table, and when I stood to leave, he didn't move. But he didn't look away either, and that, somehow, was enough. I had always believed that silence was empty, that when words vanished, people drifted further apart. But in this house, within these old sandalwood-scented walls, I was learning that silence could hold things too fragile to name, things too sacred to speak. And sometimes, silence was what remained after a choice that cost something real. It started with a letter. Again. Only this time, it wasn't mine. It was left on the kitchen table, folded crisply in a cream envelope with Lucas's name in silver ink. I found it while looking for a spoon. I didn't mean to read it. I only picked it up to move it. But then I saw the logo at the top, Wells and Langford, Corporate Acquisitions Division. Beneath it, a single line caught my eye. "We accept your voluntary withdrawal from the board. The offer to return remains open through fiscal Q3. I stared at it, heart thudding. He had resigned. From his own company. From the empire he had built with cold precision and almost brutal elegance. And he hadn't told me. I waited until evening to ask. He was in the sunroom, a quiet place with faded armchairs and windows that looked out onto the ivy wall. The light was soft there, like memories resting on your shoulders. He had a book in his lap but wasn't reading. I stood at the doorway, clutching the envelope in both hands. "Why?" I asked. Lucas looked up. His expression didn't change. "Because they wanted me to trade your mother's home for a seat I no longer wanted." I blinked. "You... what?" "There was a clause in the merger. If I sold off certain underperforming assets, I could stay on as chair. Your mother's property is on one of them." I felt my legs weaken, but I didn't sit. "You resigned? For her?" He nodded once. No drama. No declaration. "I told you, I wasn't interested in revenge, and I don't need more money. What I needed was to stop pretending I built this alone, that I didn't owe anything." The room was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't sting. It settled over us like a worn quilt, familiar and heavy. I stepped closer. "You didn't have to do that. Neither did you," he replied, repeating what he'd said weeks ago. "But we both did." There was a long pause. Then, without turning to me, he added, "I thought if I made enough, if I climbed high enough, I could undo what your father did to me. But it didn't fix anything. Not really. It just made me a man who kept score." I finally sat. "And now?" He exhaled. "Now I'm just a man." That night I made the tea, the way my mother did. Ginger shaved fresh, honey stirred slowly, a touch of lemon just before pouring. He watched from across the room, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, not closed, just resting. "You memorized it," he said. "No," I replied, setting the cup down in front of him. "I lived it." He took a sip, then another, said nothing. But the way he looked at the cup, like it was something both familiar and impossible, said more than I could. "Thank you," he said, and the words were quiet but full. "It's just tea." He looked up at me. "Not tonight." We sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. No conversation, no plans. Just the soft sound of night arriving, 1 second at a time. I wanted to tell him that I saw it now, that his silence had never been empty, only careful. That maybe, in some strange way, our marriage was no longer a cage, but a place where grief and kindness had finally met. But before I could speak, the doorbell rang. Lucas was the one who answered it. I followed a moment later and froze when I saw the woman standing in the foyer, tall, striking, in a wool coat that probably cost more than my car. She looked familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. She was older than Lucas, but only slightly. Her eyes moved from him to me, then settled with quiet calculation. "You must be Emma," she said, offering her hand. "I'm Margot. Lucas's sister? Sister. Of course." I remembered now, barely, my mother once mentioning a Margot Arden who ran a museum foundation on the West Coast. She had vanished from New York society years ago after a falling out with the family. No one knew why. Until now. Lucas's posture was straight but strained. "Why are you here?" Margot ignored him. "I came because someone told me Lucas Arden finally did something irrational." She turned to me, smiling. "Married the daughter of his enemy. Sacrificed his company for a crumbling house, and learned how to brew tea, all in the same month." I flushed. Lucas sighed. "Margot?" But she waved a hand. "Relax, I'm not here to dig up ghosts. I'm here to say, you're not him, Lucas. You never were." He looked at her, and something softened in his jaw. "That's not what Dad thought." "No," she said. "But Mom did. And so do I." She turned to leave, pausing only once more. "You chose to lose something for someone else. That's not failure. That's what we call grace." And then she was gone. Later, when we returned to the kitchen, Lucas sat at the table and rested, his hand on the wood. Just one hand. Still. Deliberate. "You know," he said quietly. This house never felt like mine until you got sick in it. I blinked. That's a strange thing to say. He smiled slightly. Maybe. But watching someone you care about go through pain, and choosing to stay anyway, that makes a place yours. That night, I returned to my room and found a new letter on the pillow. Not from my mother, from Lucas. It was short. Thank you for staying, Emma. I see you now, and I'm not keeping score anymore. My mother opened her eyes on a Thursday morning. There was no grand return, no gasp of air or whispered name, just a blink, slow, deliberate, and then her hand tightened, ever so slightly, around mine. I had come to the hospital alone, a book in my lap I hadn't touched in days. The sun was pouring through the window, catching the silver in her hair, like frost on old linen. Her voice, when it came, was rasped and small. You cut your hair. I let out a laugh that broke somewhere in the middle. 3 months ago. She smiled, soft and crooked. Still looks better than mine. That afternoon, while the nurses adjusted her IV and brought in a tray of soup she wouldn't eat, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. In my coat pocket, folded 3 times, was a letter. Not the old one, the half-written apology that had haunted me since the wedding. No, this one was different. New. Written on a page torn from a notebook, still lined and slightly wrinkled. The ink was shaky, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My mother must have written it before her relapse. Somehow, she knew I would need it later, when the silence between us was too heavy for words. I unfolded it now, in the quiet stretch between fluorescent lights and the beep of distant monitors. Dearest Em, I've seen how you look at him, and how he looks at you when he thinks you're not watching. He's not your father, and you're not me. You are braver than I ever was. You asked the questions I didn't have the strength to voice. I married for love, then stayed for pride. You married for duty, but if you choose to stay now, let it be for something softer. Forgiveness, maybe. Or peace, or tea. Love you always, Mom. I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. There were so many things she had never said when I was growing up. Things about my father, about her own regrets, about how love sometimes looked nothing like the fairy tales. But this was more than enough. This was the kind of truth that doesn't need to be loud. That evening, I returned to the estate just after dusk. The sky was the color of pewter, and the trees stood black, against it, like ink on wet parchment. A fire crackled faintly somewhere within the walls. The house smelled of cedar, and something faintly citrus. Lucas must have opened a window again. I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, chopping ginger with that familiar deliberateness, like the world narrowed down to each slice. She woke. Up, I said quietly. He stopped mid-motion. Is she still her? I smiled. Sarcastic, hungry, already asked me to sneak in coffee. He nodded, then reached for the kettle. Good. She also wrote me a letter, I added, unfolding it on the table between us. I think she likes you, though she wouldn't admit it directly, she hinted. Lucas scanned it silently, then tapped a finger on one line. Tea, he said. Tea, I echoed. We drank together by the window, in the same spot I had once sat shivering with fever, unsure of who I was or what I'd done by marrying a man like him. Now I didn't feel unsure. I felt still. He watched the steam curl upward from his cup, then looked over at me. You know, he said slowly, I thought I'd lost my mother's voice years ago. She died before we could speak again. I nodded. Sometimes silence lasts longer than grief. He glanced at me then, really looked. Not past me. Not through me. You broke it. What? The silence. Between us. It struck me then. We hadn't raised our voices. We hadn't argued in sweeping declarations or kissed in some rain-soaked epiphany. We had simply stayed, when it would have been easier to walk away. The next morning, we drove to my mother's house, not the one we had grown up in. That was gone now. This was the smaller cottage in Sleepy Hollow she had moved to before her health failed, the one with the blue shutters, and the creaky porch swing and the herb garden that hadn't been tended in years. We didn't speak much during the drive, but when Lucas turned off the ignition, he turned to me. "If you want to stay here with her, I'll understand." "I don't," I said gently. "But I want her to stay with us." He blinked. "At the estate?" I nodded. "It's not just your house anymore, and it's not just mine. Maybe if we fill it with enough voices, it'll stop echoing so much." He smiled. It was small, but real, and it reached his eyes this time. That night, we made space in the west wing for my mother. Lucas had the old music room converted into a sitting area, ordered new blankets, cleared shelves without needing to be asked. It wasn't extravagant. It was careful, intentional, like someone slowly replacing revenge with rhythm. As I tucked my mother in later that week, she caught my hand and whispered, "He makes good tea now." I laughed. "Don't encourage him." "Too late," she murmured. "And Emma?" You chose well, not because he's safe, but because he listens." Back in my room, our room now, I found one final note, slipped between the pages of the novel I'd abandoned weeks ago. It was Lucas's handwriting, just a few words. "When you're ready, I'll be here. Not because of your father, or mine, or anything we owe, but because I want to be." I held the note for a long time before slipping it under my pillow. And as I lay there, the wind outside soft and steady, I whispered to the dark the same words I'd once asked in fear. "Mom, did I do the right thing?" This time, I didn't need an answer, because I already knew. They say houses have memories, that walls remember voices, that floors soften under familiar footsteps, that over time, a place learns to make room for the people who refuse to leave. I used to think this house would never feel like mine. It was too tall, too quiet, too filled with things I hadn't chosen. But now I was beginning to think that maybe it was trying to learn me too. It began with small things. Lucas started leaving cabinet doors open, as if to say, "You belong here, go ahead, reach for what you need." I stopped tiptoeing past his study. We started bumping into each other on purpose. Mornings were still quiet, but not cold. We moved through the kitchen like a team in slow motion. He boiled water, I toasted bread. He read the paper. I listened to the news on low volume. Neither of us needed to fill the silence. Because for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was warm, shared. One evening, I came home from the hospital to find Lucas standing in the library. The small one, the one I'd found the photo album in. He had a hammer in one hand and a frame in the other. He looked sheepish. I thought maybe this wall could use something besides legal degrees. I stepped closer. It was the photo of my father and him, standing outside the old storefront decades ago. I stared at it, confused. "Why would you hang this?" Lucas took his time answering. "Because that's where it began, for both of us. I've hated it for years. But hating it didn't erase it." He paused, glancing at me. "And maybe hanging it is my way of saying, I'm done trying to." I swallowed hard. "That's not forgiveness." "No," he agreed. "But it's a start." A few days later, I caught a cold again. Nothing serious, just fatigue and a sore throat. But Lucas noticed. He didn't say anything, just brought a blanket to my reading chair, adjusted the thermostat, and left a steaming cup of tea by my side. When I looked up from my book, I found him standing in the doorway. "You don't have to take care of me," I murmured, throat scratchy. No, he replied, but I want to. That was the difference now. Everything that used to feel obligatory, duty, debt, penance, was becoming voluntary. Not because we forgot the past, but because we had decided to live beyond it. One morning, while reorganizing the pantry, I found an old jar of dried lavender. My mother used to tuck sprigs of it between folded sheets. I smiled instinctively, lifting it to my nose. Lucas walked in, watching me. "What is that?" "Lavender," I said. Mom used to say it made dreams less cruel. Later that night, when I returned from brushing my teeth, I found a small lavender sachet tucked into my pillowcase. I didn't ask how he did it. I just said thank you. We still hadn't spoken about love, not directly, but sometimes it was there, in the way he looked at me across the dinner table, or in the way he waited for me to finish my tea before he started his. One night, I came downstairs late and found the living room dimly lit. Lucas had fallen asleep in the armchair, a book open, on his chest. His features, normally so sharp, were soft in rest, like a man unguarded, unarmored. I didn't wake him. I just sat across from him, curled up on the couch, and listened to the clock tick into a new hour. It felt like the house was breathing with us, slow, gentle, steady. Eventually, of course, the world came knocking. Lucas began receiving calls again, offers to return to the company, join new boards, speak at conferences. He turned most of them down, but one he accepted. A nonprofit foundation focused on financial literacy for low-income families. I overheard him talking to the director. "I know what it's like," he said. "To be taken advantage of by someone you trusted." I didn't say anything when he hung up, but I made his tea extra strong that night, and he drank all of it without a word. Weeks passed. My mother grew stronger. She began taking walks in the garden, wrapped in shawls and sarcasm. She asked Lucas, with a deadpan expression, why there were no birds in his hedge maze. "Even pigeons avoid you," she said. Lucas, to his credit, just smiled. "They know I don't negotiate with squatters," my mother told me later in the kitchen. "You should marry him again, this time for the right reasons." I laughed. "We never divorced. Then renew it. Or at least kiss him in public. You're giving the staph ulcers." I didn't know how to explain to her that our love, if that's what it was, wasn't loud. It was made of smaller things. Tea. Blankets, books returned to their shelves. Silence without dread. It was the type of love that doesn't arrive like thunder, but like morning light, slow, soft, and always there, if you wait long enough to notice it. One night, after my mother had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, I joined Lucas in the kitchen. We didn't speak. We just stood at the stove, shoulder to shoulder, stirring our tea. He poured mine first, then paused. "Emma," he said. I turned. "I didn't build this house for anyone, but I think I could rebuild it for you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I reached for his hand, laced our fingers together, and stood there with him in the quiet. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt something deep in the house shift. It wasn't haunted anymore. It was home. It took me 3 weeks to say the words out loud. I want to visit him. Even then, I wasn't sure who I was telling, myself or Lucas. We were sitting in the sunroom, warm light slanting across the worn floorboards, the sound of the wind catching in the hedges outside. Lucas didn't ask who. He already knew. We drove, in silence, the next morning. Not out of awkwardness, just reverence. Like the road was its own kind of prayer. I hadn't been to my father's grave since the funeral, and even then, I'd barely looked at the stone. I'd watched the priest instead, focused on the rhythm of his voice, the tremble in my mother's hands, the smell of earth and wet leaves. I never let myself feel anything real that day. Now, I was ready. The cemetery was small and tucked behind, a row of cypress trees in Sleepy Hollow. There were no gates, just a simple archway of stone and rusted iron. The grass was uneven. Someone had trimmed it recently, but not well. We found the grave quickly. Thomas Whitlock. Beloved husband. Devoted father. I stared at those words for a long time. Beloved. Devoted. 2 words that sounded heavier now than they did a year ago. 2 words that belonged more to the man I used to imagine than the man I now understood. Lucas stayed behind as I stepped closer, knelt, pressing my palm lightly to the granite. It wasn't cold, just still. "Hi, Dad," I whispered. "It's been a while." I waited, half expecting something ridiculous, like a bird landing nearby, or the wind rustling the trees in some symbolic way. But the air stayed quiet, real, ordinary. "You left a mess," I said softly. "And I've been angry. For a long time." I glanced back. Lucas was facing away, giving me privacy. Not out of detachment, but respect. "You didn't tell the truth. Not to Mom, not to me. And that hurt more than anything else. Because I thought you were good." A long pause. The breeze moved slightly through the grass. Nothing more. "But now I see you were also scared. And prideful. And maybe just tired of being less than you wanted to be." I closed my eyes. "I forgave you anyway." I reached into my coat pocket and took out a folded scrap of paper, my mother's first letter, the unfinished one, the one with tear stains and the half-spoken truths. I'd carried it for weeks without knowing what to do with it. Now, I laid it gently at the base of the stone, tucked beneath a small rock. "She never stopped loving you, even when she couldn't say it anymore." When I stood, Lucas was still waiting at the tree line. I walked to him slowly, my shoes brushing the gravel path. He didn't ask what I'd said. He simply offered me his hand. And I took it. We didn't drive straight home. Instead, we stopped at the cafe near the river, the one with chipped mugs and sun-faded menus. I hadn't been there in years. Not since my father took me after my college graduation, when we were still pretending things were fine. Lucas ordered coffee. I chose tea. We sat by the window, watching the Hudson roll by in slow ripples, a tugboat pushing through the mist like it had somewhere to be, but no rush to get there. "Do you regret it?" I asked after a long while. He looked at me. "The marriage?" I nodded. He took a breath, then shook his head. "I regret how it started, not how it's become." I looked down at my hands, fingers wrapped around the mug. "It doesn't scare you? That we're building something from ashes?" "No," he said. "Because ash doesn't mean death. It means fire happened. And fire means life." I smiled. Small, but real. That night, back at the estate, I found myself wandering into the library again. The photo of Lucas and my father was still on the wall, centered now, framed in simple walnut. I stood in front of it, remembering the first time I saw it, how much it confused me. Now it felt like a bridge, not a wound. Lucas found me there. He didn't speak, just stepped beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Did it help?" he asked. Finally, I nodded. It gave him back to me, not as a hero, but as a person. He looked down at the photo. "That's all we are in the end. People, with choices." "You made some good ones," I said. He turned to me gently. "And so did you." We stayed in the library long after the light faded. My mother was already asleep in her room. The house was quiet again. But this quiet was different. Not the hush of tension, the hush of peace. Lucas walked me to the stairs. At the landing, I paused and turned back. "I'm not staying because of obligation anymore," I said. "You know that, right?" His answer was immediate. "I know. I'm staying," I continued, "because when I leave a room now, I look back to see if you're still there." Lucas smiled. Just a little. The kind of smile that meant everything. And I always will be. That night, I fell asleep with the window open. The wind moved gently through the curtains. Somewhere outside, a bird called once, then fell quiet. And as I drifted into sleep, I realized something. The house wasn't heavy anymore. It had exhaled, and so had I. The first snowfall came early that year. It dusted the hedges, softened the rooftop, tiles, and lined the driveway in a hush so delicate it seemed the house itself was holding its breath. From the kitchen window, everything looked calm, like the world had been rewritten in white. I was stirring tea. Not for anyone, just for myself. The house was still. My mother had gone back to sleep after her morning walk, a scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Lucas had disappeared into his study, leaving behind the scent of cedarwood and the sound of jazz drifting through a cracked door. It had been 6 months since the wedding. 6 months since I walked into this house with a signed document and a hollow vow. 6 months since I thought love was something other people got to have. And now, it was everywhere. We never had a vow renewal. No second ceremony. No dress. No rings exchanged under new promises. But we had mornings. And we had habits. There was a quiet ritual now. Lucas bringing me the paper with the crossword half filled in, because he always left the last 10 clues for me. I started making breakfast. Most days. Not because I had to, but because I liked the way his face softened at the smell of toast and jam. One evening, I caught him reorganizing the spice drawer alphabetically. "You're not serious," I teased, leaning against the doorframe. "Everything in this house deserves to be in the right place," he said, not looking up. "Even oregano." Later that night, I wrote the word home on a scrap of paper and tucked it between the cinnamon and the cloves. He didn't mention it, but the next day, it was still there. It was during one of those long, slow mornings in December that I asked him something I hadn't dared voice before. "Did you ever think about leaving?" We were sitting in the sunroom, mugs in hand, snow gathering on the sill. Lucas looked up from his tea. "Before or after I met you?" I shrugged. "Either." He set the mug down and leaned forward slightly. "There were times I thought I'd already left. I just hadn't moved my body yet." I nodded. "I know that feeling." "But now," he added, "I don't think about leaving. I think about staying better." I smiled. "That sounds like something from a book." "It's not," he said. "It's something I learned from you." That afternoon, I found my mother folding linens in the laundry room, humming a half-remembered tune. "You should take that boy somewhere warm," she said. "Lucas?" "No, the gardener," she deadpanned. "Of course, Lucas. We've been busy." "You've been healing," she corrected. "There's a difference." She placed a clean sheet into the basket and looked up at me. "Now it's time to live." We didn't go far. Just a weekend away. A small cottage in Vermont, tucked between snowy trees and a frozen lake. We brought books and too many blankets. Lucas forgot his razor and I forgot to care. We spent the mornings in wool socks and the evenings with firewood crackling between us. On our last night, as we sat watching the firelight flicker across the ceiling, I turned to him. "What would you say?" I asked. "If this was the moment we renewed our vows?" He raised an eyebrow. "Here? With soup on the stove?" "Exactly." Lucas leaned forward, setting his tea aside. He didn't need time to think. "I'd say, I vow to tell the truth, even when it's hard, to keep the windows open, to make tea with too much honey when you're sick, and listen when silence is all you can give me." He paused, then smiled. "And to alphabetize every drawer you'll let me." I laughed quietly. Then I took his hand. "And I vow to stay when it's easier to run, to forgive before being asked, to rebuild, not because you need it, but because I want to live in the house we make together." He didn't speak. just pulled me into an embrace so natural it didn't feel like an answer. It felt like a promise. We returned to the estate 2 days later. The snow had melted just enough to reveal the first crocus shoots in the garden. Small, stubborn things, pressing up through the frost like they knew spring was inevitable. Lucas stood at the front steps, his suitcase in one hand, the other lightly resting at the small of my back. "It feels different," he said. "The house?" He nodded. "It doesn't echo anymore." I turned to him, eyes steady. "Because we're here." "No," he said. "Because now, we're staying." That evening, while making tea, I found the note again, the one he had left for me months ago. "When you're ready, I'll be here." I unfolded it, fingers smoothing the creases. Then, in the corner, I wrote underneath his words, "I am, and I always will be." I left it on his pillow. And when he found it, when I saw him read it and tuck it quietly into the drawer beside his bed, I didn't need to say anything. Because we already understood each other. They say love begins with fire, but I think ours began with silence. And it lasted because we learned how to listen, not just to each other, but to the house, to the tea, to the quiet between words, to the stillness that remains after forgiveness. And so, this is how we stayed. Not because we had to. Not because it was easy. But because somewhere between the pain and the peace, we built something worth holding. And we held on. Together. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, so its quiet strength can reach others who need it. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through more stories of love, memory, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe. Your presence here reminds us that gentle stories still have a place in this noisy world.